And it's my pleasure today to welcome to the Today's Leader podcast, Building Tomorrow's Best Leaders Today, the author of an amazing book, Being Brown in a Black and White World. Please welcome Annemarie Shrouder. How are you, Annemarie?
I'm well, Tony. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And you're coming to us from Canada, and one of the great joys that I have is meeting experts like yourself, leaders like yourself from all around the world. So we've had a couple of other Canadians on the podcast, and it's always been a really, really good conversation. So, and once again, your book sounds amazing. I've started reading it, and it really is eye-opening. So it's called Being Brown in a Black and White World, Conversation for Leaders on Race, Racism and Belonging. And one of the things that stood out really early in the piece is that you've got an important story to tell, but you're not basing it predominantly around, I guess, the theories. You've taken a really personal slant in the book. So tell me a little bit about the story of what got you to writing the book.
Boy, I'll give you the short version. I wanted to write a book about inclusion because that's what I do. Diversity and inclusion, and in the process of working on that and thinking about what I wanted to put in there and if I wanted to write about my methodology, my personal story kept sneaking in there, and I was like, I don't want to write that story. That's not what I want to write about. This is a business book, and I just had to give up at some point and just be like, okay, what is this about? And what happened, what I hope it's about for readers is that it has allowed me to tell my story and give context to why I think conversations about race, racism, and belonging are critical.
And as we know, we all love good stories and we all build rapport with that particular story. And one of the key things also that's coming out is that you're wanting to change the conversation, because the diversity and inclusion space has had a lot of conversation over recent history, and I suppose it's been a continuation of what we've seen. But some of it's positive and some of it may be considered negative, and you're wanting to change the conversation. So talk me through the conversation maybe we should be having instead of the ones that could be occurring today.
Well, I mean, my biggest focus in changing that conversation is to move from the polarization of either or, us and them, you and me, to both and. Because I think, especially around issues of race, which are particularly polarizing, and I don't know what it's like in Australia or other parts of the world, but we don't like to talk about race in Canada. It's uncomfortable. We think we have it on lock, that we're doing an okay job. And it's so that makes it even more challenging to have the conversation. And especially when we're talking about race, but any identity, there's going to be quote unquote sides, Yeah. The challenge with the either or paradigm, and the reason I'm so passionate about it is because what I see happening in the world is what I experienced personally in my own being as a biracial individual, right? Having to choose, what side are you on? Where do you fit? That leaves us sort of juggling and sometimes feeling like we have to choose a side and speak for that side. And what we do when that happens is we stop listening to each other. And the conversations that I believe we need to have to further both diversity and inclusion and equity and a sense of belonging, not just in business, but in communities and in families, are conversations that are built on listening, on hearing each other, on each quote unquote side, whatever that looks like, whatever that means, having the space to share what's so for them, what's true for them, their perspective, and giving space for that to be heard and acknowledged, and then taking a turn listening to the other quote unquote side. How else are we going to heal from, in this case, I'm specifically focusing on racism. How else are we going to heal and move forward if we don't take the time to listen and learn from each other? We've had very different experiences.
Yeah. One of the really challenging things around the world today, and I think it's just pervading in just about every aspect of society, is that concept of sides. You're either left or you're right, or you're blue or you're red, or whatever it is. And we end up with, and Twitter is one of those, like, I love Twitter. I think it's one of those best platforms to get intimate and have conversations with people, but it's also one of the most toxic things, because we start to see people on one side of the fence just in their echo chamber. We see the other people in their echo chamber, and we're not listening. And that concept of tolerance and listening is one that seems to be missing in so many areas. And when we talk about diversity and inclusion, you know, one of the really key things that I see is that when we meet different people, and, you know, one of the part of my history is I moved organisations, and I met a lot more people from outside of I suppose my traditional comfort zone. And it was an amazing experience, because we did work together, we did listen. I broadened my own mindset, my own what I knew to be comfortable with. Right. And I've seen that time and time again when people meet individuals without any sort of whether it's sexual preference, whether it's whatever, all of a sudden it's two people connecting. And I think that we lose that in the wider narrative. Is that something that you've seen? Absolutely.
And that's one of the reasons why when I do this work with organizations, we focus on community and connection. Once we start doing that, the work becomes changes from something we're doing for the company to something that is meaningful to the person at the desk next to mine or down the hall for me, right? It humanizes what we're doing. It's so important. And lack of community and lack of connection are things that undermine inclusion.
So how do we do this, Annemarie? So how do we shift and change the conversation, and how do we make it more person-to-person, community-based?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the things that we do when we work with organizations is focus on community. So what are our clients doing to help build community in their organizations? How are they making time for people to get to know each other? How are they making time for people to socialize? And in the pandemic, that's been even more challenging, right? And so what's wonderful is we've seen so many fun things and different ways that companies are helping their employees to connect. People are being quite, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word. Tony, help me out. What's the word? Inventive.
Yeah, inventive, innovative.
Innovative, unique. Inventive, yes. So, whenever we do a session, we spend a little bit of time at the outset just helping people to connect, letting people connect. We take 3-4 minutes at the beginning, put people with one other person in a breakout room on Zoom, for example, or Teams, or wherever we're working, and just let them chat for a little bit, right? So that we remember that in addition to learning something together in the time that we have, we're also have the opportunity to get to know somebody a little bit more. Even if it's somebody you think you already know, right? We pick a question and we say, go, 3 minutes, talk about this.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the other day I'm a big believer in gamification in some of the leadership work that I do, and I've just got a set of teamwork cards, and just so that I can bring it into when I'm working with teams.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because, my initial assessment was that'll be really good for leadership, but it talks about things like personal hobbies, health, all those things as well as part of the cards. So when you play it with a team, you're actually getting to know what I would call more of the whole person.
Absolutely.
Because a lot of people still feel that they can't bring themselves to work, for example, in a productive sense. So, and in your book, you talk about the whole person.
Yes.
So talk me through that particular concept. And so if I've got a leader that's listening to this, that's sort of saying diversity, inclusion, it's just another tick and flick on a worksheet or what have you. And once again, we've seen that mindset.
Absolutely.
What is it about the whole person that can potentially change that person's mindset?
Well, when we talk about the whole person, what we're talking about, well, when I talk about it, what I'm talking about is that creating an environment where your employees can show up fully as who they are. So that if I'm working for you, if I can walk in the door, I can bring, my identity as a female identified person. I can bring my identity as queer. I can bring my identity as a person of color. I can bring my identity as a mom, right? And there's room in that space for me to express myself and share my ideas and perspectives from those different experiences and identities that I carry in a way that supports the work that we're doing together. Not to mention, social time, right? That I can show up as me in social time and not have to have that filter, or as in the Black community we call code switching. Yeah? Code switching.
Tell me about code switching.
Code switching is a term. I'm not sure if it started south of the border of us in the USA or in Canada, but it's a well-known term in the Black community or the African American community that talks about how we switch how we are at work from how we are at home. Now, I don't think that's specific to the Black community, but my understanding is the Black community has coined that particular term, code switching. So you know what you need to do, what you need to leave outside the office door to get ahead in your workplace, to make sure that you have a career trajectory. And so, you're careful about how you, specifically about what you wear and how you speak and what you talk about, so that and when we do that, you're not really being your full self, right? That takes energy. So, for leaders who are like, whole self, what is this? Is it just a fad? Think about the energy that somebody has to use in their workday that they could be spending working or being innovative, right? Trying to protect themselves, trying to make sure that nobody finds out they're part of the LGBTQ community, or that, they have to censor what they're saying because it may not be, blah, blah, blah. So it's a lot of time, a lot of energy.
And it's almost counterproductive or counterintuitive, because we've heard the words authentic leadership now in the last 5 to 10 years. And we've heard a lot of organisations preach that we're authentic leaders, this is what we do. And then we've still got aspects of what I would call those practices where people obviously can't be themselves. So that's not being authentic. So somewhere along the line, the practice doesn't match what we put into a policy manual or what we put into on the wall in respect of, the whole person or authentic leadership.
Absolutely.
So
and
when we look at, sorry.
It's okay.
You're right.
I was just going to add that when the challenge is with diversity and inclusion is that as a leader, now we know that leadership's experience of the workplace can often be very different than management experience, and often very different than employee experience, right? We're insulated in a lot of ways. And so the challenge with D&I or EDI or DIBS, whatever acronym we want to use, is that often when leaders feel like their environment allows them to be their whole selves, that it feels safe for them, that they think that is the truth for everybody. And that's not the case, right? And so then we have policies and practices that work for the people who have designed those, right? And don't always work for other people in that organization. And so part of what we need to remember in diversity and inclusion is that you can be in the same situation having a completely different experience.
But I guess it's also part of the process, but Annemarie, isn't it? If I'm a leader that feels that psychological safety in being authentic and bringing the real me to work, that hopefully should then be able to have a flow-on effect through to the people that I lead, because they're seeing potentially me being more authentic and more genuine, and providing them the space to do that. So in some ways, I'm sort of seeing that as a bit of a starting point. But it's really built around that trust aspect that we talk about so often in leadership as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. So that is a starting point for sure. And then sharing the message of our commitment to this is another piece of that starting point. And then, as you know, people are going to watch and wait for the proof, right? And the less psychologically safe we feel for whatever reason, the more proof we're going to need to actually show up as our authentic selves. Right? Or we might think that works fine for you, but maybe not for me because of these reasons, and so I'm still going to be tentative. So for me, it's always a combination of being obvious, right? Reiterating over and over again, like our commitment, and then role modeling. And then when people see our reactions to other people being their authentic selves and showing up fully, then slowly over time, those folks that have more reason to lack trust, or they don't feel supported, or they're more fearful and therefore more tentative, will slowly come on board. But it's a process, ongoing, because we're always going to learn something new to add to that safety.
leaders are on show every day, and this is just another evidence in that particular statement. So if a leader's not showing up, making the wrong comments every now and again, so a leader can build trust, start to make his team feel safe, and then all of a sudden it's one action, one word that's said in the wrong place, and all of a sudden we're back to square one. So there's some heavy responsibility in leadership, and that's something that you talk about in your book. You say that racism is a leadership conversation.
Absolutely.
Leadership is a choice, and it's a responsibility that we all share.
Yes.
So, and we talk about systemic racism that exists in society as a whole. I'm understanding.
Yes.
So, what can a leader do to navigate through that? So we've got an established system potentially that is detrimental to certain aspects of our society and our community. So as a leader, what's my role in that, in helping break that down?
I think one of the first things as a leader, our role is to identify it, to let folks know that we see it, that we know that it's happening, to share our commitment to helping to reduce those barriers that are in place, and then to educate ourselves.
Yeah.
That's not the sexy answer, because people want to dive in and do something, yeah?
Yeah.
But unless we educate ourselves, our doing becomes less effective. And for systemic racism in particular, it's been around for centuries. It's embedded in how we do things and in what we do. If we are not people of color, Black or Indigenous, we don't see systemic racism necessarily, unless we train ourselves to see it. So we need to learn what it looks like, what it means, the impact. We have to unlearn some of the things that we've been taught that aren't accurate or in their full representation. We need to listen and develop greater awareness about what systemic racism looks like, and the impact not just on our employees, but in general in the community, and also how we are impacted by systemic racism. Because no matter what the color of our skin, we're impacted. Some of us are impacted negatively because we're people of color, and some of us are impacted positively. Yeah, but we're all impacted by it. Yeah. So those are the key starting points, and raising our level of awareness and understanding is my go-to first spot for leaders.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I mentioned the concept of the old diversity and inclusion tick and flick process that some organisations on the surface may appear to be doing. But
yes.
One of the biggest challenges that I think some leaders face is what's the payoff in terms of business success, performance, and I guess that old chestnut, the return on investment.
Right.
So when we talk about the return on investment, I once again refer to the parts in your book where you talk about we're looking at increased engagement, satisfaction, productivity, and innovation.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that I see with a properly constructed diversity and inclusion program is that you're actually getting the best out of people. You're complementing the skill set right throughout the organisation, and you're allowing yourself to shine in ways that maybe you haven't shone before in the past. So how do you change the narrative or change the conversation in regards to business performance in promoting diversity and inclusion?
Well, you've listed so many of the key things that help companies understand what the ROI is. What we're doing is creating an environment where people can show up, like we've talked about, right? And in order to do that, we need to build a commitment. It's not a project. It's not an initiative. It's something that becomes part of a company's DNA.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very important that it's a journey that we're going on together.
Yeah.
It's not something that's just the HR person's responsibility or the CEO's responsibility.
Yeah.
In my opinion, it's everybody's responsibility.
Yeah.
To focus on creating an environment where people feel included. And the D and the I, we see that together all the time, regardless of the acronym. But the diversity piece is critical because representation is important. Without the inclusion piece, diversity just becomes aesthetic. And then that's another, what did you call it? Tick and flick? That's new. We call it checking the box here. That must be an Australian term. I love it. I'm going to use it now. Tick and flick.
The tick and flick. And funny, it's not funny that we're talking about it. I stumbled into the lounge room the other day, and my daughter's watching a episode of that Superstore comedy show, and Amy, who is the store manager of Latino descent, had been shortlisted for a role in their head office, and she walks into the waiting room for the interview, and they're all female and they're all Latino. And one of the ladies actually pointed that out to Amy, because up until that point she hadn't worked it out, and they basically said obviously there were Latino short on their diversity mix, and that's a comedy that's highlighting a very real problem, I guess.
It sure is, yeah, and it's hard. So this is one of the hardest things for companies when we want to become more representative. So, for example, if you look around your leadership team, and all you see are the same identities, right?
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of men, maybe a lot of white men, maybe a lot of white men of a certain age, for example. And you want to start diversifying. You have to start somewhere, yeah?
Yeah.
Being that first person to show up on that team that is different, visibly, right? Because there's lots of invisible diversity. Let's not forget that. There's lots of diversity we can't see. But if you're visibly different, if you have a different identity that's visibly different, being the lone person, the lone voice at that table is going to be super challenging. Right? That's why I always tell clients that we want to start building that inclusive environment even before we start increasing our diversity and our representation, because you want to make sure that you're ready for when you are attracting more diverse talent, that when they show up and they're sitting around the table with you, they feel like what they have to say is important. They feel like their contribution is valued, and not just heard and valued, but used, right? Yeah. Taken into consideration for when we make decisions and doing things differently. So we have to start somewhere, and if there's good, unless you're hiring two people at the same time, there's always going to be one person that's the starting point. Yeah. 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 So yeah.
Yeah, and so true. And once again, I'm just thinking as you were talking through that, you know, many people probably don't acknowledge the courage and the bravery of that, some of those initial first hires in this particular space. Because if I'm walking into a room and I'm a person of colour, or I'm a female potentially because it's always been a boys' club, the courage that person has just to be there, for starters, and then to feel safe enough to contribute, or even contribute when they don't feel safe, and I'm guessing that's another part of the leadership quest, is that you know, so many people probably discard that sort of the aspect of that person's own emotional journey to be where they are today. Absolutely.
Catalyst has put out a report a few years ago called Emotional Tax. And so this applies to anybody, but when you're in a marginalized group and you're in the workplace and you're dealing with microaggressions on a regular basis and bias, that takes a toll. So Catalyst has coined that emotional tax. So imagine in a leadership position if you're the only one, because there's so many things that happen on a daily basis in that environment that could impact us negatively, that the people around that table may not intend. It may not be intentional. Right? But because we've been conditioned in certain ways to lean in or lean away from, that person may have quite a struggle, even in an environment where they're welcoming of diversity and want to be inclusive, right? That's the unlearning piece. And so you're absolutely right. There's bravery and courage on the part of the person who's walking into that situation, especially as the only one or even one of a few, definitely. But there also has to be a different kind of courage and bravery on the part of the other people around the table to really examine their own bias, to really examine what they've learned and have to unlearn, and to be willing to be open to the feedback from those people that they're bringing in around the table, to hear when things are like, wait a minute, we're going down the wrong, right? Let's start again, or this is how I was impacted by what you just said or by the process. I think there's courage on both sides. Different, but...
Yeah. And maybe that's part of the conversation that we need to start having, or leaders need to start having with themselves, because I'm pretty confident that there's not a leader out there that wouldn't want to see themselves as being courageous. So, and when you're talking about the diversity and inclusion space, there's courage on both sides.
Yes.
And so do you want to be the courageous leader that's welcoming, encouraging, and mentoring and fostering or nurturing that diversity and inclusion, or do you want to be the leader that's sitting back with their arms crossed and just waiting for it all to sort of either implode or explode, whichever way that they want to see it? So I think that courage for leaders is something that they should be self-examining and saying, what's my role in it and what can I do to nurture this? Because it is about bringing the best person to work.
Absolutely. And even beyond the nurturing that environment, you need courage to do that introspection, right? What's my role? How am I contributing to systemic discrimination? How am I contributing to a culture where that somebody may not want to speak up or may not feel comfortable? So it's not just about supporting, it's also about going inside and thinking, okay, how am I blocking even what I would like to see, because it's unconscious, because I'm on autopilot, because it's just the way that I've been socialized, and I haven't really taken a careful look at that.
Yeah. So your book is really having a conversation that needs to be had right around the world, so I congratulate you on that.
Thank
Absolutely, Annemarie. So who's been your inspiration in your leadership journey?
Oh, good question. I have one main inspiration. I had a coach several years ago, Lisa Marie Platsky at Upside Thinking. She's been a big inspiration for me, just in terms of how she leads and how she leans into authentic leadership and vulnerability. I think that's my main go-to for inspiration. We worked together for a few years, and I still go back to things that she's said to me or that we talked about. We had group sessions and individual sessions, and it's really allowed me to step into who I am in this work. So I think that's it. She's it.
So when we talk about today's leader, and obviously the leadership world is a constant evolution, and we're constantly changing, but what are some of the traits that you would expect to see in the leaders of today, especially if they've got the concept that they want to be the best leader around tomorrow? What are some of those traits that you would see in those leaders?
Well, some of them we've already mentioned. So vulnerability, authenticity, courage, willingness to show up, and also willingness to be wrong, to be able to hear feedback, to be open to hear feedback, to be humble enough to course correct, and to own when we make a mistake. Because diversity and inclusion work, we're bound to make a mistake, right? We don't know everything about everybody. We're very well versed in who we are in the world and what we need and how we move through the world, and less versed in how other people move through the world and what they need. So we're bound to put our foot in it sometime. And then having the humility to hear impact, hear feedback, apologize genuinely, and then use the information and course correct, change what we're doing or how we're doing something. Critical components. And then I think the last thing I would add to that list would be compassion.
Yeah. And amazing traits that you've just talked through, especially things like compassion and vulnerability, I think. And there's so many leaders, unfortunately, out there that just want to try and put up a bulletproof facade, and that's all it is. It's a facade. And, when we build trust with people, it means, once again, often we will build trust if we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, because if our people don't see us as being human, vulnerable, and being able to admit when we're wrong, trust is really hard to generate if we're being this bulletproof type, what I would call a bluster and bullshit style leader who's just standing there thinking that they're infallible when ultimately their team know that they aren't. So I think that's really good. Yeah. Tell me about your relationship with failure. So how do you deal with that?
Not very well. I'm a bit of a perfectionist. If we want to be authentic.
A recovering perfectionist?
I'm a recovering perfectionist, absolutely. I think I've probably learned the most about failure from being a parent.
Yeah, okay.
You know, because every day I think I'm onto something, and then no, that didn't work, or I didn't do the thing I really wanted to because I got distracted. And so, you know, there's different ways that we fail. And I think that we can use failure to our advantage, right? That didn't work. Okay, if I'm willing to stay there and examine why it didn't work, ask for feedback, you know, if I talk to my child or you talk to your staff members, you know, what about that didn't work for you? What could I do differently next time? You know, and I've said to my child, you know, on more than one occasion, can I have a do-over? Let's try that again. You know, whether it's a conversation, we got into a power struggle about something and I just drop it and let's try again. And sometimes it works beautifully. Sometimes she's not. So she's not into it, but, you know, and I think we can do that with our teams. We are not meant to know everything all the time and be perfect. And it goes with our authenticity that we can own that and learn from our mistakes.
Great advice, great words. I'm intrigued now with your perfectionist statement. How did that go? How did that go with your book journey? So,
gosh, hang on, I'm just going to turn the light on so you can see me better. My book journey. Well, the book has been in the works for several years, so I'll start with that. Many versions, many iterations. Being willing to hear feedback and be like, okay, it's not quite where it needs to be. You know, I haven't done what I set out to do, and trying again.
Yeah.
You know, this is version, I can't remember what version this is, 6, 5, I'm not sure. And it started as a completely different book. So in addition to, you know, failure in one iteration of the book and recognizing that didn't work, well, but what is working and what is coming out of that and being able to, and I have a completely different book than I planned or started with.
Yeah, sometimes that happens, doesn't it? We just, and it ends up usually a better book because we're talking and we're getting that feedback and we're taking that on board. And but being a perfectionist, I can imagine there were some challenges in have I got my spelling right? Is all my punctuation correct?
Well, I was told somebody found a typo, so I was like, another, you know. So yeah, I think I've had to let some of that perfection go for sure with this book, for sure.
And once again, that's a really good message for leaders out there. Every now and again, we just need to let that perfectionist go and maybe be happy with something around the 80% because that's probably as good as what we're going to get sometimes. So, so Annemarie, the vision for you, what does that look like moving forward?
Moving forward in terms of the work that I do, in terms of D&I generally, in terms of conversations about race, racism, and belonging, what do you want to know, Tony?
About your impact, I guess. What is the vision for you and the impact that you want to make?
Well, my vision is to continue to have powerful dialogues with leaders specifically. As you know, if leaders get this work, then the whole organization benefits. If leaders don't understand the value of diversity and inclusion, then even if it starts from the ground up, there's a ceiling that the folks reach, right? And so I'm really committed to having as many conversations as I can with leaders to help them understand what a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion is about, why it's important, and what it means for them as leaders. What are we asking of leaders when we're asking them to have a D&I lens or to be committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion? That's my vision. I'd like to do that all over the world because I think, you know, the conversation might look slightly different depending on our context, of course. But essentially, we're talking about valuing human beings for who they are and what they have to offer, making that overt in our organizations and creating spaces where people can shine and that through that, businesses can thrive.
And I think that is one of the most worthy missions that anyone can have. So I wish you every single success that you can have along that journey. And hopefully today's conversation has started that thought process for the leaders that listen in to us. So how can people connect with you or buy your book?
They can connect with me through my website, annemarieshrouder.com. One of the things we have up there is our inclusive leadership program, which I'm planning in 2022 to open up for general registration, not just intact groups and organizations. You can find a book link on the website to buy the book, or you can go right to Amazon or Chapters Indigo. And I'm also on LinkedIn if anybody wants to connect with me there.
Excellent, excellent. And I'll make sure I've got all those links in the show notes. Annemarie,
thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure having you today on the podcast. Thank you so much for investing in today's leaders, but also investing in a better world for everyone else. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Tony.